Okay, so that. All right, so good morning, everybody. My name is Connor Flanagan. I'm the Director of Education over at the Southampton History Museum, which you can see behind me here in this lovely photo. Unfortunately, I'm not outside the Rogers Mansion right now. I am at my house, but we're going to power through and go over this lecture. Today, we're going to be talking about a man by the name of Pyrrhus Concer. He was a very important man to the town of Southampton, and more specifically, the village of Southampton. But before we get into learning fully about him and his life and what he did, we need to start a little bit before that and talk about where he came from. But before we get into the whole lecture, what we're going to do is I wanted to show the materials that were used for all the research that I did. So this is a project that I'm still currently researching and in the middle of, but I have a lot of ground made where I think I feel comfortable enough to share with everybody like we are right now. But the main information that I will talk about in this lecture will be the information I found from the U.S. Federal Census from 1800 to 1880, which I also brought home so I can continue my research while I'm here. Had them all printed out with me here. I have some records from the Southampton Town Clerk's office. Those I don't have here, I have digitally at least. The whaling log of Captain Mercator Cooper, which I also have digitally, that was nicely shared by the curator of the New Bedford Whaling Museum. There was a newspaper from Hawaii called The Friend that I've also been using. I have a copy of that as well. Then we have the Southampton magazine, which is something that we have in our archives at the museum. 2 articles from that were very helpful. It's getting lost in there. But also a few books and other pieces of data that have been really, really helpful. Most of these are primary sources, some secondary, and a lot of oral history has gone into telling the story of Pyrrhus. But again, before we get fully started talking about Pyrrhus himself, we need to learn about where he came from. So we will start with Cooper Hall. Cooper Hall was originally built by Nathan Cooper in 1805. Nathan Cooper was a merchant and became very wealthy, and thus was able to build his large house up on the hill here in Southampton Village. According to census records from 1800, Cooper had 4 slaves, and on August 15th, 1803, Cooper granted a conditional manumission of Gad and Esther Williams, who were 2 of his 4 slaves. The 2 other slaves were actually Gad and Esther's daughters, Rachel and Violet. Now, a conditional manumission means that Cooper would allow Gad and Esther to become free people, but it was under the understanding that Gad would essentially pay for his freedom by going on a whaling voyage with Captain William Fowler, and upon return, Gad would give over all the money that he made from the whaling voyage to essentially purchase him and his wife's freedom. Gad's journey was aboard the ship the Minerva, which left for Brazil from Southampton in 1804 and returned in June 1805 with 300 pounds of whale oil. So, as they went out on this trip, I'm sure it was really difficult. I'm sure it was very, very hard, but he was able to get back and get his freedom. But unfortunately, there was no mention of his daughter's freedom inside of this agreement that they made. Fast forwarding slightly to 1810, by looking at the federal census data, we see that Nathan Cooper's household contains 3 white males under the age of 10. 2 were most likely his sons, Mercator and Gilbert, with the 3rd being unknown. 2 free white males, 26 to 44 years old, most likely himself and another person. 1 free white female, 10 to 15, potentially his daughter Margaret, and 1 free white female, 16 to 25, who was unknown. 1 white free female, 45 and over, which was potentially his wife Olive. And then 4 all other free persons, which was most likely Gad and Esther. And then between the time of 1800 and 1810, they had 2 more children, which would be Millicent, who was age 9, and Prince, who was age 4. And then they had 3 slaves, which would be Violet, Rachel, and then an unknown person. So the interesting part about here is that while Gad and Esther did get their freedom, they were still counted in 1810 federal census data as living in Cooper's household. Now, we don't know if they necessarily lived inside of Cooper Hall. They may have lived on another building on the grounds, but there's plenty of interesting reasons you could think of as to why maybe they were there. their daughters, when they were in servitude to the Cooper family, were fairly young. So maybe Gad and Esther wanted to stay behind as a way to sort of raise their daughters while they were still slaves. This is an interesting look into the relationship between slaves and slave owners here in New York, specifically in the village of Southampton, and how they sort of operated with each other. And just for reference, we'll be referencing the same map of Southampton Village from 1873, and the circled portion of it there is where Cooper's Hall is today. It's still standing and is one of the main buildings of the Rogers Memorial Library. If you're ever around in town, I'm sure plenty of you have probably been there before. It's used primarily now as office space and sometimes to host some lectures. But you can go in through there and see where the Cooper family lived and where Pyrrhus and his family originally worked. Fast forwarding a few more years, we now have Pyrrhus being born, March 17th, 1814. And he was born to the daughter of Gad and Esther Williams, Violet, and his father's name was William Shadrach Concer. Shadrach was born in 1790. He was about 24 years old at the birth of Pyrrhus Concer, and Violet, being born in 1796, was about 18 years old when she gave birth. Shadrach was owned by another man named Southampton Jagger from West Hampton, and there's no actual marriage records of them, of Violet and Shadrach ever getting married. So it's hard to say what their relationship truly was, but as slaves went, their ownership was very followed a maternal line. So when Pyrrhus was born, he would not become property of Southampton Jagger and go off with his father. He would stay with his mother and become property of the Cooper family. So what we see above in this image on the screen is actually the town records of the Southampton town clerk from 1816 on December, I believe that says 16th, where Nathan Cooper is actually registering the birth of Pyrrhus Concer. This was a really, really important fact that we have this record, because this is a very important thing when it comes to indentured servants. So on March 29, 1799, the New York State Legislature passed an act of gradual abolition of slavery. Anyone born of a slave mother after July 4th, 1799 was free, with the proviso that said child continues as a servant to the owner of their mothers until reaching the age of 28 for males and 25 for females. Now, what this essentially meant was that Pyrrhus was free, but not exactly. So he would have to live the beginning portions of his life with the Cooper family, doing what they wanted him to do, almost as if he were a slave. But he did have the sort of light at the end of the tunnel, where eventually he would become free at the age of 28. There was also a fine levied against the owner if they didn't register the indentured servant in time. So by Nathan Cooper not actually registering Pyrrhus until almost 2 years after his birth, or actually almost 3 years after his birth, he was fined a fair amount of money for doing so. This was done because anybody whose slave did give birth to a child that was going to be an indentured servant, if they didn't want that child, they would have to give it up to the state, and then the state would have to pay for them. And these fines and things like that were a way for the state to make money to pay for these children who essentially had no families that they could belong to. But what was the real difference between being a slave and an indentured servant? And truly, there wasn't that much of a difference. The really only big difference was that servitude had either ended when they were 25 or 28, and slavery was for life. How your servant life would have been was extraordinarily dependent upon how nice your master was. If your master decided to beat the servant and treat them really poorly and things like that, they could do the same thing, and they may not even make it past 20 years old. But if they had somebody who treated them somewhat fairly, or at least gave them the necessities of life, they would eventually be able to gain their freedom. So it was an extraordinarily case-by-case basis, and really up in the air on how your life would really turn out at this time. But again, moving forward slightly through time, we get to 1817, when Nathan Cooper dies on December 4th. He was survived by his wife Olive and children Mercator, Margaret, and Gilbert. At the time of his death, his family and their slaves and indentured servants all continued to live on the Cooper Hall property. In 1819, Pyrrhus was either sold or his servitude transferred to the Peltro family upon Cooper's passing. Now, unfortunately, there was no bill of sale, although oral history says he was sold for $25. So all the digging that I've done, I have somehow not been able to find any sort of records talking about this sale. We do have an accounting book from Nathan Cooper. It is really, really badly damaged due to time. So some things are a little hard to read. I think some pages are maybe missing, but unfortunately we have not been able to find any sort of real record of Pyrrhus being sold. But he could have been sold, he could have been transferred, it could have been just moving around of wills. Maybe Olive, Cooper's wife, didn't want to have all these slaves in indentured service on her property anymore. They didn't have the need for everybody, so they wanted to thin out who they had responsibility for. There's plenty of options we could find here, but the oral history that sort of teaches that everyone's known and informs a lot of what people think about Pyrrhus was that he was sold at 5 years old for $25, which is honestly probably one of the more believable stories that could have happened. So moving forward to the 1820 federal census data, you would think this would answer a lot of questions for us. Who got Pyrrhus, where Pyrrhus went, at least in 1820, where he might have ended up. But unfortunately, the 1820 census data leaves us with a real mystery. It doesn't exactly tell us. In the federal census data here, we look for the Peltro family, I looked for the Cooper family, I looked for Gad to see if he had his own household at this point, and which he did, but Pyrrhus was not listed on his. He was not listed on his father, Pyrrhus Concer's household. He was not listed in any Peltro living in Southampton or any Cooper living in Southampton. So it's a complete mystery as to where Pyrrhus was in 1820. This isn't exactly a novel thing, because sometimes people of color and also women were not always counted correctly at this time when it came to all these federal census data and history in general. So it's very possible that the census taker showed up at the Peltro house first before Pyrrhus got there, and then by the time he made it to where the Coopers were to take their census data, he had already left, and maybe it was just a bad timing. Given he was a small child, maybe he was just out running around or not around when the census taker was there. Who knows? But oral history leaves us to believe, and also future data we'll talk about in a second, leads us to believe that he ended up with the Peltro family. Specifically, we believe that he was purchased by either John or Charles Peltro. John Peltro was born in 1755 and died 1822, a few years after Pyrrhus was supposedly purchased. Charles Peltro was his son, who inherited his father's home lot on the corner of Toilsome Lane and South Main Street. So whether John purchased him or Charles purchased him, regardless, Charles was the one that ended up eventually sort of raising Pyrrhus. In the 1830 census records, Charles' household contained one free person of color between the ages of 10 and 24 years old. Pyrrhus would have been 16 at this time. And not much is known about the particulars of Pyrrhus at this point in time in his life, but Charles being a farmer, it was most likely that Pyrrhus grew up working on the farm. It wasn't a large farm by any standards. It was sort of a standard home lot farm. And almost everybody at this time had their own sort of home farms they were working on. And most of the neighbors were Peltros, or at least cousins of Peltros. So Pyrrhus probably would have spent a lot of his time bouncing around Main Street, helping out on different farms and things like that. Now, the Peltro family name is also fairly synonymous with Southampton, as we own we manage at the Southampton History Museum, the Peltro Silver Shop, which was run by Captain Elias Peltro, who was a captain in the American Revolution and a renowned silversmith. His son was John Peltro, and then his son was Charles Peltro. So Charles was the grandson of Captain Elias, who was the famous silversmith and patriot that many people in Southampton know about, and you can still visit his silver shop today if you're ever on Main Street. And again, referencing this map, so we see that Cooper Hall was sort of right there in the middle, and then when he moved down to the bottom where Charles Peltro's property was, right on the sort of corner of Toilsome and South Main Street. So Pyrrhus still living in the village, while being separated from his family. It's very possible that he still maybe would have seen them or interacted with them slightly in and around the village, as they were not too far away. They probably all shopped at the same place, all went to Town Pond together, now known as Agawam Lake. Very, very possible. And again, looking at the 1830 federal census data, as I mentioned before, there was one free person of color at this time, which would have been Pyrrhus at the age of 16. An interesting fact about Charles was that he actually never married or had children of his own. But he did have a lot of different people living with him throughout his life. So as I moved forward in my research and I collected all the data from the federal census from all the way up until 1880, up until his death, he always had different people of completely different ages and sexes and races living with him. And a lot of oral history tells us that Charles himself was a very religious man. And so perhaps he sort of operated his home as a place to take care of people who were in wanting. At least that's my best guess, is that he would bring people in to work with him and then also to sort of help people out maybe when they were in need. So moving along into the years in which Pyrrhus got his freedom. So as we talked about before, Pyrrhus should have gotten his freedom when he was 28 years old, if you followed the strict laws of the Emancipation or the Abolition Act. But as time went on, abolition sort of became a little bit of a brighter concept for people in the North, specifically here in Southampton. And we're not really sure exactly, as I said, whether his indentured servitude was transferred or maybe the Pelos just sort of took care of Pyrrhus or whatever it may be. But he got his freedom sometime between 1832 and 1835. According to his obituary, Pyrrhus was given his freedom by the Pelos family when he was 21 years old. But oral history says that he was given his freedom around 18 years old. So we're not really certain what happened here, but what is known is that Pyrrhus began his whaling career at the age of 18. And maybe he got his freedom the same way his grandfather did, going out on a whaling journey, coming back and sort of purchasing his freedom from his owner or master, Charles Pelos. His first whaling trip was when he was 18 years old, and he was known as a greenie aboard the Captain Edward D. Sayre's ship Boston. A greenie would have been also known as a green hand, and essentially the lowest rank aboard a whale ship, doing really all the grossest, worst work, scrubbing the decks, preparing food probably, pretty much everything that nobody would really ever want to do. The ship left from New London, Connecticut in July 1832 for the South Atlantic and returned in February 1833 with 1,900 barrels of baleen oil and 1,600 pounds of whalebone. And what we see pictured behind there is the Sayre House, which is actually still on Main Street today and is a really gorgeous house and fantastic. And there's a marker right outside of it. So if you're ever driving down South Main Street, you'll see the big blue New York State historic sign marker. You can stop and take a look at it. His second whaling trip was done almost immediately after that, when Pyrrhus was 19 years old. His rank was unfortunately not listed for this, but he was most likely still a green hand or maybe like one rank above. He sailed with Captain Jeremiah William Hedges aboard the ship the Columbia, and they left from Sag Harbor, New York in June 1833 and returned in May 1834 with 75 barrels of whale oil from sperm whales, 1,685 barrels of baleen, and 1,500 pounds of whalebone. Both these trips, they came back with loads and loads and loads of materials, making themselves a nice bit of money. And for those interested, the barrels of oil from sperm whales were probably the most precious oil that you could get, as it burned the cleanest and had all the best uses. Barrels of baleen essentially means baleen oil, and that would be oil derived from any sort of whale that had baleen in its mouth rather than teeth, like the sperm whale, whose oil was still great and wonderful and everybody loved it, but it wasn't as pristine as the sperm oil. And then the 15,000 pounds of whale bone is not actually bone, it's actually the baleen. They refer to it as bone sometimes, but that would be when they caught the whales, they would cut the baleen out and bring that back to use for a variety of options. So evolving as a whaler. As the years went by, Pyrrhus continued to go out on whaling trips, eventually becoming a boat steer, one of the highest ranking positions on a whale ship. The ranks on the whale ship would start with the captain, then you'd have the first mate, the second mate, and however many little mates you wanted to have. And then right below that, you would have your boat steer. And the boat steer is seen in this picture right back there in the back of the boat. They'd be in charge once they were down in the water in the smaller vessels going out hunt of whales to keep the boat upright and make sure that they were able to actually secure, capture the whale, and bring it back to the main ship for it to be processed. So he was responsible for really protecting the lives of probably hundreds or thousands of men throughout his years as a whaler. and then moving forwards to the 1840 federal census data, it gives us three possible options as to where Pyrrhus would have been. So when we look at Gad Cooper, which is interesting now when we see Gad Cooper, because his name was originally Gad Williams, but as the years went on, Pyrrhus's grandfather's name changed to Gad Cooper. So he potentially took the surname of Cooper, who was originally his owner. And on his federal census data, it included one free male colored person, 24 to 35 years old. Shadrach Concer, Pyrrhus's father, had one free male colored person, 10 to 24 years old. And then Charles Peltro, the man who owned and raised Pyrrhus, had one free male colored person, 10 to 24 years old. So at this time, three possibilities. Sort of the one indicator is that Pyrrhus would have actually been 26 years old at this time. So by the ages, he shouldn't be at Shadrach's house or Charles Peltro's house. Other information for that is in the 1840s, they actually tracked the jobs. At the Peltros, there was two people working in agriculture. At Shadrach's, there was one person in agriculture and one person in the navigation of canals, lakes, and rivers. And at Gad's house, there was one person in agriculture and one person in the job of navigation of the ocean. Given this info, the fact that Pyrrhus was 26, it is most likely he was living with his grandfather at this time. Also living was Pyrrhus's grandmother and a free person of color, 24 to 35, which doesn't fit any of the ages of his aunts at the time or his mother, who at some point remarried and moved to New York City. I'm not sure exactly when his mother would have left the town of Southampton. This unknown person could very well have been Pyrrhus's future wife, Rachel. However, there are no records of when they were actually married exactly, or when she moved to Southampton from Orange County, New York. So there's a little bit of mystery there, but given the fact that at Gad's house, the age fits and then the job is almost perfect with navigation of the ocean, it's most likely that once he got his freedom, he was actually able to move back in with his grandfather and his grandmother and return to a somewhat almost normal family life. But now we start to talk about what really made Pyrrhus's life the most special, where he really made the most history throughout his life. By the start of 1840s, the American whaling industry was starting to boom. Pyrrhus was lucky enough to be whaling during the time when the industry was truly exploding. And everybody was able to make a lot of money very, very, very quickly. One such person was Captain Mercator Cooper. This is the same person who was the son of Nathan Cooper and grew up in the same house that Pyrrhus spent the first 5 years of his life living. And Captain Mercator Cooper actually then hired Pyrrhus to be his boat steerer for his 1843 whaling voyage to the Pacific Ocean. They set sail on Wednesday, November 8th, 1843, out of Sag Harbor aboard the ship known as the Manhattan. So while they were out there at sea, the Manhattan headed all over the world in search of whales, eventually getting to the Pacific Ocean. And on Wednesday, February 12th, 1845, so yes, that's almost 2 years after they left Sag Harbor, they landed at what was called Port Lloyd on what is known as the island of, sorry for my pronunciation, Chichijima, which is approximately 100 miles north of Iwo Jima. So as they were out in the Pacific Ocean, they would run out of supplies from time to time. You would need to get fresh water, wood, food, different things like that. And Port Lloyd was a sort of famous port in the middle Pacific Ocean where a lot of whalers would stop off because there would be a lot of food. There were some local Japanese people that lived there, so you could trade and get different things that you needed. And there were really, really rough seas at the time, and the ship had taken a bit of a beating. So they actually wanted to stop off for a month, do some repairs, and get ready to go back out to sea in March at some point, go hunting for some whales. On Saturday, March 15th, 1845, the Manhattan lands at the island of St. Peter, now known as Torishima. So again, after about a month, they did some repairs. They set back out to sea. They stopped off at this island as they thought it was inhabited, and they came out onto the land in search of some sea turtles that they wanted to capture to eat, and maybe some other supplies that they could check out while they were there. But as they got close to the island, they actually noticed a weird looking ship. They recognized it as almost being what's known as a Chinese junk, but it looked a little bit different, so they weren't really sure what was going on with the boat. Here we see in the background what a Chinese junk looks like. So the ship they saw probably looked similar to that, but slightly different. And upon coming on land, Cooper soon came across 11 shipwrecked Japanese sailors. So the ship ended up being Japanese. At first, the Japanese were scared that they would be killed by Cooper and threw themselves on the ground asking for mercy. But Cooper and his crew were able to slowly get them to understand that they were not there to hurt them and just were interested in who they were, what was going on. And through a series of signs and sort of probably playing a lot of charades with each other, they were able to understand that they were actually Japanese and they were shipwrecked there. So Cooper wanted to save these men. He wanted to get them and bring them back home. As a person who made his life's worth sailing around the world as a fisherman, he probably knew the dangers and had a lot of sympathy for these men who were stranded on this island for who knows how long. And he probably wanted to do the right thing and get them home. But he also knew that Japan was a closed country at this time, and being able to go back to Japan and maybe show them that Americans were nice, and as a way to sort of ingratiate himself to the Japanese government, maybe this could lead to opening some doors politically between America and Japan. So who knows really what Cooper's true mission was, but two of those are very obviously tied to why he would have gone back. But why was Japan closed? Well, Japan's isolationist foreign policy was referred to as Sakaku, meaning closed country. And it was first enacted with some edicts and policies between 1633 and 1639 by Tokugawa Iemitsu, who was in office from 1623 to 1651. And this was done to stop the Western influence from penetrating Japan's borders. They saw the damage that Western influence was doing all around the world, and they wanted to cut all that down from happening to them. They wanted to stop the spread of Christianity into their country, stop the spread of sort of the capitalism ideas, and sort of keep their feudal way of life going. They allowed some trade with neighboring Asian countries like Korea and China and a few other places. And the only Western country they did any dealings with were the Dutch. They were allowed to come into one small port on the south end of Japan, and that was it. That was the only place that anybody from the West was allowed to come. Anybody else who ever actually came to Japan would immediately come under fire. And in fact, Cooper was very aware that a few years before they made their discovery of these shipwrecked Japanese sailors, an American vessel also found some shipwrecked Japanese men and attempted to bring them home. And upon reaching the coast, were immediately fired upon. And the ship was almost sunk. So he knew the dangers of this, but still pressed on forward to do it. So as they began to sail towards Japan on Sunday, March 16th, 1845, they came across a heavily damaged fishing boat that was sinking. On the ship was another 11 Japanese sailors, now making the total refugees 22. And they also were able to take a lot of items from the boat, like some rigging, the ship's catch of pickled salmon, which some of the sailors actually remarked that when the salmon was split halfway, they were 4 feet across in size. So they were actually astounded by the size of these fish that the Japanese were able to catch. They also got some books and heavily detailed map of Japan showing the whole coastline in great detail, which is probably one of the best finds that they could ever actually get. The Japanese were gracious and allowed them to take whatever they wanted from the ship, but the fishermen tried to make it as clear as they could that they needed to be very, very careful and hide this map and any of the books that they had on the ship, because when they got to Japan, their boat would most likely be searched, and if they found any of these items, there's a good chance that everybody could be killed, including all the fishermen that they saved. So they need to be very, very careful of this. So Cooper actually took great deal to hide the map on the ship. On Sunday, March 23rd, 1845, in Cooper's whaling log, there's actually first sight of light coming from Japan. The next day, he remarks that they got closer and could inspect the land a little bit, and that it appeared to be under culture. And throughout the rest of his log, he really talks a lot about Japan and being really impressed with how it looked and really excited about being there. Just a lot of great flowery words about it. And here there's a little bit of a discrepancy about what exactly transpired when they actually got to Japan. Thankfully, when Cooper left, after this whole ordeal was done on his way home back to America, they stopped in Hawaii and were able to give an interview for a local newspaper. And I was able to find an interview, and in there's a slight bit of difference between what actually occurred via the logbook and what actually occurred via the interview. My speculation on this would be that maybe Cooper would have been worried that if the Japanese could speak or read English, that if they read the logbook and he wrote down exactly what occurred, then maybe they wouldn't really like what happened. But in an interview, Cooper says that they landed a bit north of Tokyo and sent some of their rescued Japanese sailors to warn the government of what the Americans were doing. But in the logbook, it says that they were approached by some fishing boats and they sent some of the rescued Japanese sailors ashore that way, maybe because they didn't want to say exactly that they went ashore. Or maybe they wanted to boast a little bit and tell them afterwards that they did go ashore. It's a little hard to tell. But either way, the Manhattan soon was blown right back out to sea due to some stormy weather. And it took them actually 2 weeks to actually get back to the waters around Tokyo. But on Friday, April 18th, 1845, now back near Japan's coast, a barge approached the Manhattan, and a man in rich dress, along with a Dutch translator who spoke some English, alerted Cooper that his visitation was approved by the emperor, whose name was Ninko, but that they would not be allowed to land. So what ended up happening is described as a really crazy scene where over 300 ships came out, tethered lines to the Manhattan, and actually rowing towed the ship into Tokyo Bay. And once it was there, it was surrounded by 3 rings of boats. And all these boats, the first ring, the boats were so close together that you could actually walk from ship to ship without touching the water. The second ring of boats had a little bit of passage between it, so other boats could come in between. And then the third ring, the boats were much more spread out. And this was done to ensure that the Americans were under 24/7 surveillance and that there was no possibility that they could ever get out and get to land. Once they were there, the Japanese boarded the Manhattan, and they also confiscated all weaponry on the ship to ensure that nothing dangerous could happen. And I'm sure at this time the Americans were extremely scared. Maybe Cooper had a better idea and was more comfortable, but I can imagine some of the other ranking guys on the ship were maybe a little scared and freaked out. I know at least I would be as to what exactly was going to transpire while this time they spent in Tokyo Bay. An example of how serious the Japanese actually took this was while they were there, Cooper, not wanting to rest on his laurels, instructed some of his men to start repairs on one of their smaller whale ships. So they began to lower the ship down, and as it approached the water, the Japanese all drew their swords on the boat and got ready to start killing everybody on board and yelled at them to everyone to stop. They stopped, and Cooper and his crew were able to explain to them they were just trying to fix their boat. They're not trying to escape or do anything weird. And it's actually remarked in Cooper's whaling log that they all ended up having a good laugh about this, which I think is really crazy. And the Japanese actually then helped bring the ship manually onto the larger Manhattan, and then actually assisted with the repairs on the smaller vessel because they knew it wasn't allowed to go in the water. So they were able to do all of it on the boat and then put it back up on the rigging, which I'm sure took a lot of crazy manpower to hoist this big boat all around. So for 4 days, they spent docked in Tokyo Bay, surrounded by all these ships. And when they were finally able to leave the ship and head home, all the shipwrecked sailors, when they were finally able to leave the ship, it was reported they hugged and thanked Cooper and everybody else on the ship, letting them know how thankful they were for rescuing them. The Manhattan was visited by many people, some dressed in beautifully colored tunics, while others were in sort of everyday rags. But everybody was extremely interested in the clothing that the Americans wore, because the Japanese all wore silk and I forget now, of course, but the Americans all wore cotton, which the Japanese did not have. So they were all super interested, and everybody wanted to trade constantly all their clothes. So I'm sure most of the crew were able to get some souvenirs from this time. The governor of Tokyo also visited the ship and passed along a note from the emperor, saying that he was very thankful for them to come aboard, come to Japan and save these men, and basically saying his good graces were well welcomed. In Cooper's whaling log on April 19th, 1845, he states that the gentry is frequently coming on board to view the ship. And here we actually have a depiction in Japanese art of the Manhattan while it was docked in Tokyo Bay. A really fantastic find that we were able to have, showing that this event did occur. The next image we have here is a picture of what we believe to potentially be Pyrrhus Concer. Here it is. So as Cooper noted, the high class wore silk and the lower class wore cotton. We're all amazed by the Americans' woolen clothes. So that's what it was. They didn't have access to wool, or maybe just didn't have it, but Cooper at least noted that they all seemed to be really impressed with the wool clothing of the Americans. The other point of interest on the Manhattan was Pyrrhus Concer, and as well as the other people caught on the board, like his uncle, Prince Gad Williams, and there was also record of a Native American named Elizur who was on the boat. I'm sure there may have been a few others that unfortunately there was no log kept of all the men that were on board, but it was reported that all the Japanese were very interested in all these different people of color that were on the ship. The presence of African Americans was probably quite interesting in particular, as there was probably nobody of that look that these sort of common everyday Japanese folk would have seen. And there's actually many oral histories of Pyrrhus and Prince telling stories of their encounter with the Japanese, who actually tried to rub the black off of them, not realizing that their skin was actually so dark. This was reportedly a story that Pyrrhus liked to tell often in sort of jest, talking about how crazy his whole experience was over there. And there was also a lot of stories of Pyrrhus singing songs to entertain the visiting Japanese. He sang in the church choir and was apparently a very good singer. Probably one of the most interesting things was that when the Japanese sort of gentry and governor and stuff came on board, it was reported that Pyrrhus sang them songs as sort of like a welcoming sort of entertainment thing. And it was most likely that Pyrrhus was singing Christian songs. And one of the main reasons Japan was a closed country was to stop the spread of Christian influence. So it was probably a good idea, a good thing that the Japanese didn't have a good foothold under what Christianity was. Otherwise, they probably all would have been killed right there. And actually, thankfully, the last time I talked about Pyrrhus Concer and showed this image, I was actually able to talk to somebody whose, I believe, sister-in-law is Japanese and was able to transcribe the Japanese writing below him. And it says black steersman in there, which Pyrrhus Concer was the steersman of the boat, and he was black. So my best guess is that that would be him. Now, I don't know if he had that really awesome yellow jumpsuit, but one would hope. The other image we have here is in the same book and is most likely Mercator Cooper. So it's really interesting that we actually have depictions of the two men that we really want to talk about. Somebody thankfully took the time about 200 years ago to draw both of them. But on Sunday, April 20th, 1845, Cooper and his crew were given wood, water, rice, rye in the grain, sweet potatoes, radishes, chickens, tea, and some crockery composed of the lacquered ware of the country, and the Japanese refused all payment. This is all recorded in Cooper's whaling log, talking about all the wonderful gifts that they were given, and every time they tried to repay them or buy anything, they were always told no. This is all gifts for them for the gratitude they had for returning these men home. They were also given an autograph by the emperor, and also a very, very stern warning to absolutely never return again. While they were so happy that they were able to save these Japanese men, they made no consignment or concedment in saying that the Americans could ever come back. And in fact, Mercator asked, well, what if we find more Japanese? What if we leave and we find some more shipwreck guys? Are we allowed to come back? And they said no. The best option that they could have is to maybe find a Dutch ship and pass them off to the Dutch and have them sort of taxi their way back home. But they were given a letter to keep on board that was written in Dutch and signed by the emperor, saying, talking about everything that they did to rescue these men, and that if Mercator ever found himself in need, that any ally of Japan was required to give him all assistance that he would ever be needed. So this was probably a really great sort of get out of jail free card if you ever got in trouble with the Dutch. But this whole humanitarian mission took about 5 weeks to complete. And really the only reason that the emperor understood and was so thankful for them was that he knew that the large amount of time it took for them to actually persist with this deliverance of shipwrecked Japanese men. On Monday, April 21st, 1845, due to some bad winds, Manhattan was not able to actually leave Tokyo Bay, so they had to be towed out again. So all these ships from the ring spread back out, tethered their lines, and towed the ship right back out to sea. Once leaving Japan, they headed north towards what's known as Kamchatka, Russia, and then all over the Pacific Ocean. Before going home to Long Island, Manhattan stopped in Amsterdam to actually sell all of their bounty from their whale hunts, and then return to Sag Harbor eventually on October 14th, 1846, making the total journey take 2 years, 11 months, and 3 days. Almost 3 full years sailing around the whole world. In our collection at the museum, actually on display inside of our building, the Sarah Barn, in our whaling exhibit. We have this map, which was created, I believe, in the 1950s by either a volunteer or potentially a museum staff member at the time, showing a few different whaling journeys. And the red lines, which I know are a little difficult to see on here, actually depict the journey of Pyrrhus Concer and Mercator Cooper. Now that I actually have the log of Mercator Cooper, I want to go through because it thankfully has actually all the longitude and latitude points for every entry, which is almost every day that they were on this journey. So I can go through and plot more exactly whereabouts in the world they were going. Because according to the log, I believe they actually did not go around the bottom of Africa. I believe they went down around South America and then up into the Pacific Ocean. So this map might be a little bit inaccurate, but now that we have the log, I can maybe spend a few days transcribing 300 something pages of whale writings, or whale journey writings. Very, very sloppy quill pen. As time went on, Pyrrhus made a lot of his money and the biggest impact of his life as a whaleman, but he eventually retired. Pyrrhus's grandfather died at some point between August and October of 1841, a little bit before this historic journey. And in 1843, just before leaving, Pyrrhus was given his grandmother Esther's property and home due to her inability to handle her affairs. Not exactly sure what that meant, but it was most likely that his grandmother maybe didn't have the money or the means or maybe the physical ability to take care of the property that she inherited from her husband after his passing. So Pyrrhus, being maybe not having land of his own at this time and having a fair amount of money from his whaling journeys and living with them, took over the responsibility of handling that household. And given the fact that he was living with his grandparents at this time, that's most likely why he did that. And then the first record of his wife is seen on March 6, 1847, a little while after returning from his historic journey, when they were both baptized and admitted to the First Presbyterian Church, which, if you're in the village of Southampton, is right across the street from the Rogers Mansion, our main office at the Southampton History Museum. And while there is no official record of Rachel ever really working anywhere as like a physical job, she was known to be an expert gardener and helped out Pyrrhus a lot with sort of his jobs and things like that he did later in life. Pyrrhus's next adventure was aboard the Gold Rush. Gold was discovered in California on January 24th, 1848, and news traveled very fast. A group of Long Island men formed the Southampton and California Mining and Trading Company, and they set sail on February 8th, 1848 on the Sabina for San Francisco. So not even a month after the first discovery, word got to Long Island, and not only that, so many men invested so much money so quickly and were able to head out almost immediately to try and get over to California and start their hunt for gold. Pyrrhus is one of the 15 men on the ship who worked for their passage, most likely due to his many years as a whaler. This was easy for him to do. And given the fact he also had a bit of money, he was also able to purchase a half share in the company itself. This meant that when they got there to California, as these men all went out to the world in hunt of gold, they were supposed to all come back, share their gold together, and Pyrrhus would get 1/2 share of the gold that everybody found. So meaning that if he got really unlucky and ended up finding no gold, but somebody else found thousands of dollars of it, he would actually get a portion of it. So it was a really great idea and concept. But as they set out, the Sabina, the ship they traveled out on, was found to be maybe the worst ship that they could have got on. They spent almost the entire journey doing repairs on the boat, bailing out water, plugging holes, and they didn't arrive in California until August 12th, 1849, in the town of Pittsburgh, funnily called, which is somewhat near San Francisco. The company quickly dissolved, as most did not find gold, and some who had success did not share the profits that they should have. So some of the men that did actually get rich and find gold just kept it, and a lot of people gave up very, very quickly, and sort of everyone just abandoned and decided to just go their own ways. And within 9 months, the Sabina was taken back to San Francisco and sold, as there was no way that that ship was ever going to make it back to New York. Here, Pyrrhus goes a little bit dark. We don't know anything about what happened here, really what he did in California, how much time he spent there, but what we do know is December 7th, 1850, a ship named Georgia arrived in New York City from Havana, Cuba, by way of Charges, Panama, carrying a man named Pyrrhus Concer, who was listed as a mechanic. Pyrrhus most likely decided to head home soon after arriving in California, probably for the best, and started his sort of way jumping on boats and trying to work his way home. Somehow ended up down in Panama, got on another ship, headed toward Cuba, and then from Cuba was able to get back to New York City. There probably took maybe another boat, maybe a carriage back out to Southampton to get home. But we're glad he was able to get back, because the 18 federal census data really starts to open up our eyes about what Pyrrhus and his family was like. Because this is the first time that they actually really recorded everybody else's names that were on the property, not just one person of this age that had this skin tone. So what we see is that Pyrrhus Concer was 36 years old, listed as a seaman, and lived with Rachel Concer, his wife, who was 44 years old, his son, James Harvey Concer, who was 2 years old, and his grandmother, Esther Williams, who was 79 years old. They had a second son named Charles, who died in infancy. So we're not exactly sure when Charles would have been born, but an interesting note about that was that one of his sons' name was Charles, and Charles was also the name of the man who sort of helped raise him, who was kind of his slave master. Sort of leads into a weird understanding of maybe what their relationship would have been like. Maybe Charles Pelos was a really fair, nice man, and maybe Pyrrhus was really glad to have been raised by him than anyone else, and was able to name one of his sons after him. Or he just liked the name Charles. But it is a funny sort of thing that occurred. What's interesting is right below Pyrrhus's listing, the second listing there is for Prince Gad Williams, who was the uncle of Pyrrhus Concer and son of Esther Williams. He was their neighbor, and he was living in his house with his wife, Mary, and daughter, Harriet, at the time. So again, going back to the map, we can now see where Pyrrhus and Prince's homes were. So we have them starting their lives up at Cooper Hall. Pyrrhus eventually moved down to Charles Pelotreau's house down in South Main Street, and then popped over to Pond Lane to have his own homestead right over there. So while he's traveled the world and went all these places, he still always lived and has roots right here in Southampton Village. And here we have a photo of his home on 51 Pond Lane from a few years ago. It was on the northwest corner of Lake Agawam, and by 2013, the original structure was still there, but was privately owned. Sadly, it was actually demolished. A few years after that, the Southampton Village was able to take some historical artifacts from the building first. And when it was demolished, the bones of the structure, the more historical pieces of it, were actually kept at the Southampton History Museum, so that eventually in the future, at some point, we could figure out a way to reconstruct the building somewhere. Eventually, the village was able to purchase back the land with their some of their funds that they had, and processes are being made right now to reconstruct the home. Here we have a picture on the top right showing ideas for what they want to do when they reconstruct Pyrrhus's home, and below that is a monument that's across the street from Pyrrhus's home on the corner of Lake Agawam, talking about Pyrrhus and what his life was all about. The end goal is to finally rebuild Pyrrhus's home and make it a place to educate all on both his legacy and African-American history in the region. So hopefully within a few years' time, we'll be able to get that sort of project finished, and maybe I'll be able to go over there and give this talk there and talk about Pyrrhus in his actual home. But moving on from 1850 forward, he got his home on 51 Pond Lane, and he began to acquire more land. In 1854, he purchased 2 acres from Sylvanus Howell for $150.70. I would love to be able to buy 2 acres of that much money right now. And in 1859, he owned almost 5 acres of property. And in 1860, he purchased another ½ acre from William and Abigail Jagger. And in 1891, a couple of years down the line, he obtained a ½ acre estate of his uncle, Prince Williams, by actually suing Prince's heirs to collect the debt. Now, we're not certain what this debt may have been. Maybe Prince owed him money or from a loan or something like that, but either way, he was able to obtain his neighboring property. And then later in 1891, he sold 2 acres of his land to a man by the name of John P. Popkin, Esquire, for approximately $3,500. Pretty good return on his money from the $150 up to making $3,000. Going to the federal census data from 1860, 1870, and 1880, it sort of all stays very much the same. In 1860, Pyrrhus, now 46, is listed as a fisherman, living with his wife Rachel, 54, and what's listed as Jazz, most likely his son James, who was 12. In 1870, Pyrrhus, now 56, is still listed as a fisherman living with his wife Rachel, who should be 64 by this time, but is now listed as 60, and was listed as keeping house. So we're not certain when his wife would have been born or what her real age was, because from here it changed. But regardless, she's still listed as living there. But sadly, their son James died in 1869 at the age of 21 years old. But there is no record as to why. But Pyrrhus owned $800 of real estate and had a personal estate of $500 at this time. And then in 1880, Pyrrhus, now 66, is listed as a sailor living with his wife Rachel, who should be 74, but is now listed as 70. And she is still listed as keeping house. Now, being listed as a sailor has a great deal of import in talking about his next sort of business venture they went on to later in life, which was his ferry business. So while he retired from whaling, he still had a great tie to the water. So he spent a lot of his time fishing, making money that way. But later on in life, he retired to sort of a more easier business of running a ferry boat business on Lake Agawam. Now, where Lake Agawam is, the tip where Pyrrhus's house was, it was right in the heart of the village, and the other end was right by the beach. And if you lived in the village and you wanted to get to the beach in the late 1800s, you would have to walk quite a far way to actually get down there, or if you're lucky, maybe ride your horse if you had one. But a quicker way would be to throw Pyrrhus a penny or a nickel, and he'd hop on his boat and head down the lake with Pyrrhus, maybe hear some old fantastical whaling stories, and then head on your way to the beach. He also rented out rowboats for 10 cents an hour and 25 cents for a half day. But being a man of great faith that he was, he also did not operate his business on Sundays. This was made apparent in about 4 or 5 different things that I read, how tied Pyrrhus's faith was to also his business practices. Another great bit of history about Pyrrhus was that during Southampton's 250th anniversary in 1890, they had a great pageant and parade throughout the village, one of which was celebrating all the great whaling captains who were still alive. Who we have pictured in the boat on the extreme far left is a very shadowy figure known as Pyrrhus Concer. He was able to go, retake his position as boat steer right in the back of the boat there, sort of directing traffic of how that boat would actually go around in the water, and was paraded through town and celebrated by everybody else in the town. Everybody knew Pyrrhus as being one of the best whalemen, and really the reason why so many other men in that village were probably still alive and able to make the money that were able to make their families rich. So Pyrrhus was extremely highly respected throughout the whole village because of his whaling, his accomplishments during whaling. So it was really wonderful that he was actually able to be applauded by the whole village during this parade. Pyrrhus eventually died on August 23rd, 1897. His wife died sometime earlier on May 10th, 1890. But Pyrrhus was remembered by many who knew him as a great and kind man, and many old writings about Pyrrhus, those who knew him had many kind things to say about him. After his death, Edgar Green purchased his boats and took over the ferry business on Lake Agawam for at least the next year, keeping the memory alive. Here we have a poem by Reverend Jesse Halsey that was written talking about Pyrrhus, sort of about how great of a person he was. Jesse Halsey was born in 1822 here in Southampton and attended the First Presbyterian Church alongside Pyrrhus. So he grew up with Pyrrhus, knew all about him and his life from living in the village and attending the same church as him. In the poem, it talks about truly how great he was, and one excerpt from it says, "Everybody trusted Pyrrhus. Mothers sent their children to the beach. He looked after them. Many fathers had reason to trust him. They'd been to sea with him. He'd saved the lives of more than one of them. Everybody liked Pyrrhus." Now, I'm not a critic of poems. It doesn't exactly rhyme, and I don't know much about poems, but I do know that those lines there talk about truly just how everybody probably felt about Pyrrhus and the whole village, about how great he was, about everything that he did, and everybody really appreciated him as a person. He was also able to get involved in a little bit of philanthropy. Pyrrhus was known to be a kind man. In an article from March 27th, 1886, in the paper called The Signal, there is mention of Pyrrhus cleaning out Lake Agawam and coming across a 50-cent piece, which he donated to the Seamen's Friends Society. It's a little bit of a small donation, but I mean, finding a quarter on the ground and throwing it in your pocket is a pretty common thing, but the fact that he made a big enough deal to take the money he found and donate it in such a way shows that he had the idea of giving in his heart. And also upon his death, Pyrrhus left behind $5,000, which was split up between many different charities, with the largest sum of it going to the Presbyterian Church. The money that was given to the church was also earmarked to be used for education purposes. So he had a great idea of wanting to give back to the world in some way with what he was able to earn in his life. This charity did not exactly extend to maybe his family, whereas upon his death, some of his would-be heirs actually sued to contest his will, but Pyrrhus's will was ruled to be valid by its executor, Henry H. Hildreth, who said he spoke to Pyrrhus near his death about including his heirs. He actually said, "Pyrrhus, wouldn't you like to include some of your heirs in this?" I believe he had some nieces and nephews or second cousins that could have really benefited from this. But he was quoted as saying, "No, not 1 cent. Let them scratch as I have had to." So Pyrrhus was definitely a hardworking man and definitely appreciated everything that he was able to earn in his life. And in the end, I mean, everyone's allowed to decide what they want to do with what they have. And he decided to give his money to charities that really meant something to him and probably helped him in his life. So giving money to the church, giving money to the Seamen's Friends Society and places like that were probably really important to him. Today, you can actually visit his gravestone in the North End Burying Ground. And it has a really great quote inscribed on it that was chosen by his neighbor, Eli Root. And it says very simply, "Though born a slave, he possessed those virtues without which kings are but slaves." So that really speaks volumes. Again, that with the poem together really just illustrate how well respected and loved this man was throughout the whole village. So again, looking at the map, we have his home originally at Cooper Hall, moving down to Charles Pelletreau, his house on 51 Pond Lane, and now his eternal resting place in the graveyard. While Pyrrhus spent his whole life sailing around the world, he still always managed to come back home and spend his whole life here in the village. And he left behind a really great legacy. His legacy of which still is talked about today. And in fact, on Tuesday, July 18th, 1972, a monument commemorating Mercator Cooper and the crew of the Manhattan, Pyrrhus included, and their venture to return those Japanese men home to Tokyo was immortalized in a monument in Tokyo Bay. So the man responsible for this was a man named Howard Van Zant, who was the VP of ITT Far East and Pacific Inc., a sort of technologies company that was based in Japan. He had no affiliation with Southampton, but found out about this wonderful story and was just so touched by it and loved Pyrrhus and this idea of everything that he was responsible for creating this monument out in the middle of Tokyo Bay. And present day, there's, as we talked about before, a lot of efforts to rebuild his home and turning it into a museum where the public can go and learn about Pyrrhus Concer, learn about the history that he was able to impart on everybody, and be a great place for people to learn about local African-American history. Pyrrhus Concer's story is the perfect linchpin to talk about so many parts of Southampton's history. If you want to talk about slavery, whaling, the everyday life of a village man in the mid-1800s, it's a great resource that I think everybody should know about. And I've made great strides to bring this up to school boards, to every classroom that I'm able to visit. Pyrrhus Concer is probably the biggest topic that I talk about when doing education programs with grade school kids. So we're trying to make sure that everybody knows about him, continues to know about him. And I thank you all for joining me for our first virtual lecture here at the Southampton History Museum. We do have a bunch more. We're going to be doing one of these every single month by different members of the staff. And if you go to southamptonhistory.org/calendar, you can actually RSVP on there for our upcoming programs. I believe almost all of them are up there right now. And we'll be updating that a lot in the next week or so with a lot of different programs. And you should also go to southamptonhistory.org/blog. And you can read our blog titled History Talks, where we're posting a lot of great insights into our collection, a lot of great articles that'll be written by museum staff, and a lot of really wonderful things. If you do have any questions, now would be a really great time to go to that Q&A section in the Zoom tool tab and send me any questions you might have. I'd be more than happy to answer them. And let's see, not so much a question, but fantastic talk, great research, well done. Thank you very much. But again, I believe if you are not sure where the Q&A section is, on the toolbar, if you click around on the screen or if you just hover the mouse around, it should come up. It'll bring up a new dialog window where you could send in any questions you might have. If anyone is interested also in any of the documents that I used during this talk and research, I'd be more than happy to share pretty much everything. You can send me an email, cflanagan@southamptonhistory.org, or a message to our website or wherever you want to get in touch with us. And I can send you, I have pretty much everything as PDFs, and always happy to share everything that I have. Let's see. Hi, Connor, it's Brenda. Hi, Brenda, thanks for joining. Brenda Simmons is the director of the African American Museum here in Southampton, the Southampton African American Museum, SAM. And she's really wonderful, and she's been a lot of help. She was actually one of the first people that mentioned Pyrrhus's story to me when I first started working at the museum, and got me interested in doing all the research and all this work for it. So thanks, Brenda, for all that. And she's really helpful, really just in general, and doing these education programs with the kids in the schools. And I know, Brenda, I believe you're still away right now at this time. And we're probably, even if you were back, we wouldn't be able to meet up, but hopefully soon we can meet up and go over some of the more research that I found and can show you all the documents. Let's see, I got a question. Where's Pyrrhus's home? Oh, yes, sorry. So Pyrrhus's home is on 51 Pond Lane. So let's see, if I go back in the talk, I can pull up the annotation. So Pyrrhus's home is right over here, and it's right on the corner, the northwest corner of Lake Agawam. So if you go into Southampton Village and you go down Hill Street, which essentially, so if you go down Montauk Highway to get into Southampton, you would go, that street would turn into what's known as Hill Street, which here is called Two Canoe Place. And right at this weird sort of like junction, you could actually turn and head down what is known as Pond Lane, and you'd be able to find where Pyrrhus's home lot would have been. Oh, and sorry, yes, Brenda reminded me that the town wasn't the one that purchased the home lot. It was actually, or not the village, it was the town CPF. I believe that's the preservation funds. They were able to purchase the plot back. And the village, I believe, is the ones working on trying to get the structure rebuilt, with a lot of close work with the African American Museum. Again, I'm not exactly sure on the progress on that. Let's see, fantastic talk, Connor. The benchmark for what a thorough and informative lecture looks like via this medium. Thank you. Hopefully that we can continue this sort of methodology for doing our lectures. I believe our next one will be on Captain's Row, which will be a talk about Southampton Main Street, which you can actually, again, see right here on this map. Pyrrhus will probably mention a little bit in that one as well, talking about all the different captains that actually lived on Southampton's Main Street, which is right here. So up North Main, down Main Street, and then down South Main itself. That'll be next week's talk presented by Zachary Taylor. Let's see, another question. Where is the boat used in the Pyrrhus? Where is the boat used in the Pyrrhus? You could clarify that a little bit more. The boat, so if you mean the boat that was used by Pyrrhus during his whatchamacallit, ferry business, we don't have the actual boat. The village did have a program that was going on. I believe Brenda wasn't very much involved with it. That they actually had a ferry boat that was going around Lake Agawam, and you could actually get on it, learn a little bit about Pyrrhus, and sort of have a tour through Lake Agawam. But unfortunately, due with the environmental concerns and the pollution of Lake Agawam, they had to stop that program a few years ago. But our current mayor, Jesse Warren, has enacted a lot of great policies trying to clean up the lake, and they're still really working on trying to get the lake cleaned up. And our goal is that hopefully within a few years' time, the lake will get to a place where it won't be as heavily polluted. Then we can go through the process of figuring out getting a boat put back on the lake, and then we can get a knowledgeable person in charge of driving the boat who would also be able to give some basic information about Pyrrhus and give sort of a mini version of this talk to give people a tour of the lake and talk about him and what his business and what he was like as a man. Let's see. If anybody else has any other questions or anything else they would like to share. Otherwise, we'll head out of this lecture. Yeah, well, thank you again, everybody, for tuning in and watching. Hopefully this went over okay. And if there were any things that else you'd like to know, feel free to send me an email. Again, I'd be more than happy to share any information I have. And I've seen it from you, Brenda, saying you would love copies of everything. I'll definitely make sure to send you a giant document of everything that I did research on. So again, thank you, everybody. And hopefully you'll be able to tune in next week for Zachary Taylor's lecture on Captain's Row.